Okay, I think I am now live. Yep, it looks like the stream is working. So, today we're going to be talking about Gerald Dworkin's piece on paternalism, and this is a direct response to Mill, as you'll see very early on. So what we read for yesterday is this is exactly a response to that. Okay, so let me jump into it then. So the first few sections you'll notice of the Dworkin piece are quite quick, but they set up what's to come later, so they're actually some of the most important parts of the paper. So Dworkin starts by analyzing Mill's principle down to two parts. The first, he says, is that prevention of harm to others is sometimes a sufficient condition for interfering with someone's liberty. And the second point is that a person's own good is never a sufficient reason to interfere with their liberty. Now, I'm not sure this is exactly the right way to understand Mill's harm principle, but it's a reasonable approximation at the very least. So, Dworkin in his paper here is intending to argue only against this second part. He in fact thinks that just about everyone agrees with the first part of it. And in the process, of course, he's going to be arguing in favor of paternalism. So, Dworkin in Section 1 begins by explaining the difficulty of giving real-world examples of paternalistic laws, since in fact most laws are passed for a number of different reasons and have many different justifications. In Section 2, he gives a list of different laws or possible laws that likely have paternalism as a large part of their justification, although he admits that many of them were passed for other reasons as well. So these first two sections go pretty quickly. It is, I think, very useful for you to look at Section 2's list. Let me just pull it up here. Because it gives you a better idea of the kind of laws that are at stake, the policy implications of this sort of argument. And lots of these laws are laws that still exist today. You can probably think of even more examples that exist today that are justified on paternalistic grounds. Maybe not solely on paternalistic grounds, but that's a significant part of them. So moving on then to Section 3, Dworkin points out that paternalistic legislation often targets the liberty of people who are distinct from those that it is advancing the good of. So things that could rightly be called paternalistic legislation don't always have to follow the formula of restricting someone's liberty for their own good. It could be restricting someone's liberty for someone else's good. So cases like requiring that doctors be licensed. That's for the good of the patients, not for the good of the doctors, yet it's the doctor's liberty that you could understand as being restricted. Of course, you could understand patients' liberty as being restricted by that as well, because it limits the number of different practitioners they might go to when they're looking for medical information, medical attention. But to a large degree, the liberty being restricted is that of the doctors, and they're not the ones who are supposed to benefit from this restriction. So he uses this point to make a distinction between two types of paternalism, what he calls pure and impure forms of paternalism. Pure paternalism, on Dworkin's account, occurs when the people whose liberty is restricted by the regulation or prohibition are identical with the people whose good is being advanced by that. So these are cases like the prohibition of suicide, requiring people to wear seatbelts. The people who have their liberty restricted are the people that we're trying to benefit. Impure paternalism, in contrast, is when the group of people whose liberty is restricted is not exactly coextensive, or is not exactly the same group as those whose good that we're trying to promote. right? So we can think here, as before, examples like professional licensing. You could also think of regulations on cigarette production. If we banned cigarette production in order to prevent the harms of smoking, we wouldn't be trying to promote the good of the cigarette manufacturers, except insofar as they might also be smokers, right? Okay, even though, right, so just to clarify, even though the cigarette manufacturers are the ones whose liberty we're restricting, they're not necessarily the same people as the people whose good we're promoting in that case. Okay, so moving on to section 4, Dworkin wants in this section to make a distinction between paternalism and something which might look very much like paternalism, but is in fact just a form of collective action. So some laws that you might think of as paternalistic, Dworkin says, for example, a maximum work hours law, where, for instance, you might not be allowed to work for more than 40 hours a week. Now, there's obviously a reasonable interpretation of that law where it sounds paternalistic. For the good of the workers, we restrict their liberty to overwork themselves. We stop them from working too much for their own good. But Dworkin suggests that in some cases laws like this might rather be the result of people trying to engage in a kind of collective decision which they wouldn't be able to come to without the compulsory elements of the law. So it's a kind of strategic situation they're in that maybe all of them do want to have a cap on work hours of 40 hours per week. None of them want to work more than that, we could assume. Yet, even though that's the case, if they tried individually to limit their work hours to 40 hours per week, they could end up losing their jobs to people who are more willing to go beyond what they actually want to work just in order to keep their employer happy, for instance. So they're in a sort of strategic situation. If you're familiar with prisoners' dilemmas, I'm not going to talk about them, but if you are familiar with it, that's the sort of case Dworkin has in mind, where everyone would be willing to limit themselves, but only on the condition that everyone else is limiting themselves as well, so that no one can take advantage of them limiting themselves in that way. So because people will only agree to do this on the condition that everyone else is doing it, Dworkin's thought is that the law stepping in is not a way of restricting their liberty, but just permitting them to come to this agreement. Okay. So moving on to section 5. So having gone through all of his previous clarifications and analysis, Dworkin now begins his critique of Mill directly. He starts by going over Mill's arguments, and I'm not going to do this in any great depth because this is most of what I did yesterday. One thing to note about his discussion, though, is that Dworkin is rightly pointing out that it is unusual for a utilitarian such as Mill to take such a strong stand on an issue like this. To say that paternalism is never legitimate, rather than to say that there's rather than to just say that there's a strong presumption against it. So he gives cases where Mill has very similar sorts of arguments, but he doesn't go to the extreme of saying that something of that sort is never legitimate, rather he just says there's a presumption against it. So, for instance, government interfering in the economy. He thinks that Mill says there's a strong presumption against it for all these reasons of the government often fails to do it well, there's advantages to the free market, but he doesn't say that it's never permissible for the government to interfere in the free market. He just says that they have to meet a large burden of proof. And Dworkin rightly points out that it's more natural for a utilitarian in particular to have that sort of view, that it's just a strong presumption that can be overcome, because utilitarians, like Mill was explaining in the piece that we read, they're not going to base their arguments on a notion of natural rights or any sort of abstract notion like that. They're basing it just on what is good for society, and that's going to be largely contingent on the particular circumstances that come up. So Dworkin's right to point out that there's some tension between Mill's utilitarianism and his strong stand here. At the end of the section, Dworkin pushes on a point where Mill's absolutism about prohibiting paternalism falters in a way, and that's the case of slave contracts. We talked about that yesterday when I talked about possible exceptions to a natural interpretation of Mill's harm principle. And as Dworkin points out, Mill's principle which forbids slave contracts, which is roughly that paternalism is justified in that case. Well, Mill might not call it paternalism, but limiting someone's liberty to engage in that sort of contract is permissible in order to protect their future liberty as an individual, their future freedom. And Dworkin says, if that's the sort of principle that we can utilize to get around the harm principle, then that's going to have much wider ranging forms of paternalism than Mill might have imagined, justified under it. So this is sort of a big part of Dworkin's strategy, is to point out areas where even Mill says something like paternalism is justified in this case, and push him on that, and see how far can we take that beyond what Mill might have assumed. So Dworkin in section 6 is looking in particular at these sort of issues. Where can we push on Mill a little bit more? And he points out that the reasons that Mill has for restricting his argument to capable adults, not to children, not to adults who have debilitating mental disabilities, which make it difficult for them to reason. So, for instance, children's inability to delay gratification, or at least the assumption that children are unable to delay gratification to the extent which a capable adult could also apply to some adults. Some adults are not very good at delaying their gratification. So you might think, on the basis of this, look, there's no real difference between the child and the apparently capable adult in this case, because they have the same problem of deferring gratification. So Dworkin wants to stray away from this form of arguing, however, since he thinks that it's going to end up leading to far too great an imposition on people's liberty. Because for just about anything where someone has a different view than us, we could claim that the reason that they have this different view is they're just insufficiently rational, and their ideally rational self would choose differently. So it's not an imposition on them, really, just as it's not an imposition on children, for us to impose restrictions on them. Dworkin doesn't want to go down that path. Dworkin is he's a liberal. He wants to allow people to make a lot of their own choices. He's just going to have more room for paternalism than Mill does, but he doesn't want to go so far that he opens the door to unlimited paternalism. So Dworkin goes on to consider the following case. Suppose that someone consents to have their freedom reduced in the future, when they expect that they'll be making a bad decision. They expect that the circumstances will be such that they won't be able to restrain themselves. So the classic example of this is the example of Odysseus and the Sirens. So the story here, it's an ancient Greek myth, and Odysseus is traveling through this area that's known to have sirens, which are these creatures which produce beautiful music that lure anyone who hears them towards a rocky shore where they crash their boats and die. But the music is so beautiful that it overcomes them in the moment and always draws people towards it. So the standard operating procedure for sailors going through this area, as the myth goes, was to block off their hearing in some way, to put wax in their ears, and prevent themselves from being able to hear. But Odysseus wants to hear the beauty of the sirens without having the siren songs, without having the detrimental effects of steering into the rocks. So what he does is he orders his men to put wax in their ears like normal and tie him to the mast of the ship, to tie him up so that he's not able to move, he's not able to control anything, he can't jump out of the boat or try to steer it towards the rocks. And also, he orders them to disobey any command he gives to release him or to steer the boat towards the sirens during this time. And Dworkin takes it as obvious that this is a perfectly reasonable thing for Odysseus to do. He knows that he's going to be in a situation where he's not going to make a rational choice in the future, and so he rightly tells his men to restrict his liberty under those circumstances and not allow him to do what he says at the time he wants to do, and instead to take his previous cool-headed rational thinking as his actual desires, not the ones that he expresses when under the influence of the siren songs. And so Dworkin says, look, we can do this ourselves. We can do this in the real world, not in the world of Greek myth. If we know that we have some sort of addiction, we can call upon our friends and family to stop us from indulging in that addiction. Even if at the time when we're going to be indulging in it, we insist, no, this is what we want to do, you appeal to the previous cool-headed thinking when the person said, stop me from doing this, and gave you permission. And so Dworkin thinks we can use this to defend paternalism more generally. He says that in accepting our government and its powers, we put some paternalism on the table. We put on the table the possibility that we can allow the government to make these sort of decisions for us in cases where we expect that we're not going to be very rational. We then have the task, Dworkin says, of setting up reasonable limits on this power so that we avoid tyrannical results, right? We don't want to give the government unlimited power to say that our decisions are irrational in a particular case and restrict us. We want to limit this as much as we can, while still getting the good results of this future, this previous consent to a future restriction of liberty. So Dworkin starts out his proposal by suggesting that there are some goods that maybe everyone would want, just in order to pursue whatever their vision of the good life is. Health, for instance. Any vision of the good life, Dworkin says, is going to include good health in order to pursue it. Likewise, you might think compulsory education for children, which even Mill seems to support. The trouble with this proposal, as Dworkin points out, is that life is full of trade-offs. Yes, everyone values health to some degree, or has some reason to, but health at what cost? Sometimes we do things which sacrifice our health to achieve other goods. Sometimes we eat unhealthy foods because they taste good, and enjoying good-tasting food is part of the good life. Sometimes we don't exercise as much as strict health guidelines might require us because we're busy doing other things. We're busy doing other things in our lives. So we don't want health at any cost. We want health at some reasonable cost, which fits into our overall life plans. So we need then to decide between those trade-off schemes, Dworkin says, which are rational, and those which are irrational, those which go overboard in trading off important goods for temporary conveniences or other goals that we might have. So we could imagine if all trade-off schemes were considered rational, then no paternalistic law could survive the scrutiny of this condition. The difference in trade-off schemes could always explain the differences among people's decisions. So Dworkin wants to find some way that we can say some trade-off schemes are in fact irrational. If you say that the inconvenience of putting on your seatbelt is greater than is worth the trade-off of the possibility of dying in a car accident that otherwise you would only have minor injuries in, then Dworkin wants to say that sort of trade-off scheme just doesn't make sense. Not in the case where someone just enjoys living dangerously or has other goals which make it the case that part of the appeal of not wearing your seatbelt is all of these other aspects, but rather just in the case where it's just a matter of inconvenience, and you just think the inconvenience of putting on your seatbelt is the trouble. He thinks that those sort of differences are just not legitimate. They're irrational trade-off schemes. So Dworkin then moves to cases where the person we're trying to help is simply ignorant of the relevant facts, or that those facts aren't salient to them. That is, the person isn't paying attention to them. And this is moving past the issue of trade-off schemes. So you may come into a case where you would agree that the trade-off... Sorry. The trade-off is... I feel like I'm going to sneeze. The trade-off is worth it to put on your seatbelt. So Dworkin says this of himself. Like, he often doesn't put on a seatbelt because he feels the inconvenience to him at that time. But he does accept in his rational, cool-headed moments that the inconvenience is certainly worth the extra safety. But it's just at the time, when he's actually making the decision of putting on a seatbelt or not, it always feels to him like the trade-off is more significant. And he thinks in these cases there's a good role for paternalism. When people don't disagree about the trade-offs, they have the same goals, they don't even disagree about the trade-offs. They're simply ignorant of the relevant facts. So, for instance, if someone thought for some reason at a particular moment that they could fly and were going to jump off a building, they're just ignorant of the fact that they can't fly at that moment. So it's reasonable for us to stop them, he says, and explain to them the facts. Or if a fact isn't salient, such as in the case where Dworkin's deciding to put on a seatbelt or not, the issue there is not that he values convenience so much greater. It's just that at the time he's not really thinking about the probabilities of his death versus his survival in a car wreck. So that's the sort of case where Dworkin thinks, even if we think that deciding rationality versus irrationality in trade-off schemes is quite difficult, there are other cases where it's still easier to say paternalism is justified here. Another kind of case where Dworkin thinks paternalism may be justified is when the action being regulated or prohibited is regulated or prohibited because it would fundamentally change our ability to choose in the future. So this is again pushing on this idea from the earlier section where we restrict someone's liberty in the present in order to preserve their liberty in the future. So for example, taking addictive drugs, as Dworkin says, if you take an addictive drug, you might end up less able to not take it in the future, and so that limits your future liberty. However, these cases might be, in fact, quite limited, as even Dworkin points out, depending on social circumstances. So, as he says, if there is an inexpensive and adequate supply of heroin, then maybe the risks of taking heroin are not very high, or at least much lower than they are today, because you have this easy way of accessing heroin, and so the drug addiction doesn't damage your life quite as much. So it's a case where we need to think carefully about what is causing something to be the sort of thing that fundamentally changes our ability to choose in the future, that changes our liberty in the future. Is it the thing itself that we're doing, or is it our social circumstances around the thing itself? and that might call for a different response on a policy level. So the next kind of case that Dworkin points to is one where a decision is being made under extreme pressure, which might be interfering with our reasoning capabilities. Because we're not thinking clearly in those cases, it makes sense, according to Dworkin, to restrict you and wait for your cooler head to make a rational decision. So we can think of cases like suicide, where often when people are committing suicide, they're in a very, obviously emotionally charged state, and they might be not thinking in the same way that they would if we let them cool down and think about it some more. So Dworkin suggests that in these sort of cases, we should have imposed waiting periods, where you say you want to commit suicide, let's wait a couple days, let's have you talk with a psychologist, talk with some other people, and then make a decision after all that. Now, notice that he wants to say waiting periods and not prohibitions, because he doesn't want to go too far in the paternalistic direction. He still wants to allow people the liberty to make their own decisions, but only when they're making those decisions with a relatively cool head. And you can see a similar case of this in Mill, even, when he's talking about the person walking towards the faulty bridge. So that case isn't just meant to illustrate a case where someone lacks information. It's also a case where someone's making a decision that they wouldn't make in most of the circumstances, in circumstances where they're thinking rationally. And he thinks that it's permissible for us to stop them and have them wait until they're able to make that decision rationally. To make the decision which satisfies the desires that they actually have, rather than the desires which are the result of irrational thinking or charged emotions at that moment. Okay, so there's one final kind of case that Dworkin has in mind where paternalism he thinks might be justified. And it's somewhat complex. He gives a nice discussion of it, but it's difficult to recount in full here, so I really encourage you to read this portion a couple times, because it does take a good amount of study to understand this case. Let me go down to his discussion so I can get a better explanation of it here. But the thought is that there are three sort of classes of people who we might reasonably engage in paternalism for. So the first is the class of people who just don't know the facts. These people don't need paternalism so much as they need education. They need to just be informed about the facts, and then they'll make a reasonable decision on their own. The second group of people is those who have low willpower to enact their actual plans. So they actually consent to people interfering with them. This is like the case of Odysseus and the sirens. And in this case, Dworkin says this isn't even paternalism at all. This is just helping people overcome a psychological weakness that they have. And there's nothing paternalistic about that. The third case, and this is the more difficult case, is people who have psychological failings of another sort. It's not that they have low willpower and can't enact their plans. It's that they have certain biases, they have certain cases where their emotions are taking over their reasoning capacity. And the thought here is if we stripped away those biases, then they would act differently. And so we need to be careful about this, according to Dworkin. We need to be sure that we're actually just stripping away the bias and not fundamentally altering what these people's point of view is. But in those cases, he thinks there is some room for you to help. Okay, so at the very end of this section, Dworkin comes to his two principles for limiting paternalism while still allowing it some scope. And this is really a very important part of the piece. It comes at the very end, and it's very quick, but it's something that is really key to understanding Dworkin's position. And so these are the two principles. The first is that the burden of proof for paternalistic legislation is very heavily on those who want to enact it, and not on those who don't. So the people who want to enact it must show the exact nature of the harmful effects being prevented or the beneficial consequences being achieved, as well as the probability that the law will actually bring about the effects that they say it will. So this is a condition that prevents the overuse of paternalistic legislation in cases where it might not actually have the good effects that it is supposed to have. And this is the sort of test that Dworkin thinks a utilitarian would likely use, that there's a strong presumption against paternalism, but it is possible in cases where it can be really shown that it's going to help. And the second restriction, or the second principle that Dworkin gives, is that the law must be the least restrictive possible alternative for achieving the desired end. So we want to minimize, according to Dworkin, the liberty that we lose in getting the benefit of the law. So if there are two cases, one both of them are trying to achieve the same end, and both of them would achieve it to roughly similar extents. The one which interferes with our liberty less is the one that we're required to choose, according to this principle. Right? So that is it for Dworkin. If there's anyone watching, they can ask questions. So there's a question here about my email. If you have trouble with my email, you should always feel free to post in the discussion forums on D2L, because I check those just as regularly as I check my email. But just to be clear about what my email is, it's mortallaro@email.arizona.edu. So the standard Arizona ending part of the email with my last name and then M is my email address. I think I've emailed all of you at some point, so you should also have it in your inboxes somewhere. Alright, yeah, so feel free to post any questions that you have on the forums, email me, or attend the live stream tomorrow, and you can feel free to ask questions about anything from this module. And that is going to be it for today. I'll see you tomorrow.